Good evening all, and welcome to Women Redesigning Food Systems, our Food Thinkers series at the Centre for Food Policy at City University of London. It's great to welcome you here today for a talk that I, for one, am particularly looking forward to. My name's Professor Corinna Hawkes. I'm Director of the Centre for Food Policy, and we are hosts of this series of Food Thinkers that feature women redesigning food systems. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome this evening Shima Barakat of the University of Cambridge. He'll be giving a talk, Leadership for Transition to a Sustainable Food System, the Experience of We Lead Food. So Dr. Barakat is the Director of the Entrepreneurship for Sustainability Programme at the University of Cambridge. She's an entrepreneur, she's a director, she's an academic, and she says she's obsessed with making the world a better place. And in so doing, she's particularly concerned with entrepreneurship and how you build the environment as a strategic issue into organisational strategy. So she's been at the University of Cambridge for 13 years, and on the side, she runs a fantastic programme on women's leadership called We Lead Food, Women's Leadership in Sustainability and Entrepreneurship in the Food System. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome her. She's going to be talking about women's leaders, the role of women leaders in the transition to a sustainable food system, and making the case that the leadership that we currently see isn't good enough. It's not fit for purpose if we're going to truly transition to a sustainable food system. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available online after this evening on our YouTube channel. We are going to, Shima is going to talk for 45 minutes and then we'll be open for questions and answers. Do post those questions into the chat, into the Q&A function whenever they come to mind. You can wait till the end, but you can also ask them as Shima is talking, and I'll come back to those at the end. We often get a lot of questions, and I will try and get them answered, and I will moderate those and pass them on to Shima to answer as best as is possible. We really hope that you listen carefully to Shima, but we will say that if you do want to tweet, the hashtag is Food Thinkers and our handle is Food Policy City. And if you do want to receive regular updates about our events and what's happening at the Centre for Food Policy, please type your name and email address into the chat function, sending it just to the panelists. And I'd also like to say that we're absolutely delighted to welcome on the 3rd of February, not long from now, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, who's a special envoy of the UN Secretary General for the 2021 Food Systems Summit, which is a huge event in the world of food systems. And Agnes is obviously a very prominent figure in that. So we're delighted to welcome her on February the 3rd. With no further ado, I would like to hand over to you, Shima, and look forward to hearing your talk this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corinna. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and part of the series that has women speaking about all these issues, all my favorite topics in one place: food, women, sustainability, changing systems. To give you an idea, I'm a repurposed engineer, so I feel that I'm inherently sustainable, having gone from an engineering career into more management and then onto entrepreneurship more specifically, having had that sustainable ethos and orientation going through. I started my career working for the same consortium that built the Channel Tunnel, but they were at the time building the Cairo Metro. And some of the things that I saw there around how resources were being used, how water that was kind of effluent was being dumped untreated into sewer systems. But the real shocker was when I sat in a meeting and the tunneling team was discussing tunneling under Cairo and the fact that they'd found some pharaonic remains. And the debate was, do they declare these remains to the authorities or do they not? And declaring the remains would mean that tunneling would stop. Most probably the tunnel would have to be redirected. It would lose the project a lot of time, and it would certainly be very expensive, because one of the quirks of building an underground system is that the stations are built first and then the tunnel is tunneled through. So having built these two stations, trying to redirect this tunnel was going to be a disaster. And therefore you can imagine what happened there. No declarations were made and the tunnel just went straight through. And so that was the first shock. I leave it to your imagination who all the people around the table were, and me. And so that was that one decision, trying to address resource use. Again, we're in Egypt, we're in Cairo, it's hot, leaving materials out to decompose and stiffen up from being in the sun and so on. Then we'd have to buy them again. I was a cost controller. I could really see the impact on the budget. So I tried to make a sustainability argument that, this wasn't really the right thing to do in terms of resource use. That fell on deaf ears. I tried to make the economic argument, and that for a long time fell on deaf ears as well, until somebody turned around to me and said, but Shima, you must understand we're working on a cost plus project. The higher our costs are, the more we spend, the more the client pays, and we get a bigger percentage. So there was no incentive for anybody to take this seriously. So I got increasingly more intrigued about what made people take sustainability seriously, and particularly what made businesses react and become more sustainable. And so my talk today, while is broadly on leadership, and we've certainly seen some fantastic examples on women's leadership in the political sphere in the last year around the pandemic, that isn't the position I'm coming from. My knowledge is very much working with business leaders, with entrepreneurs, and with talking about We Lead, the we stands for women's entrepreneurial leadership. That's the We Lead. And so that's really the data, the evidence, and the experience I have, and that I'd like to share with you today. If any of you are here for answers, I can tell you now that I'm going to disappoint you. I don't have the answers. I would challenge anybody that says they have the answers. I think we have glimmers and pockets of insights that together at least allow us to change some of our practices and choose which way to go. So I'll unpack what I mean by that as we go forward, but really I'm not aiming for a single answer. In fact, I'm going to conclude about a whole variety of sets of areas where we need to think and change. So in terms of sustainability, we're all aware that we're facing big social and environmental problems. That's the realities we face today. And that was even way before we had to deal with a pandemic. We also know, for those of most of us here are interested in food, that we have issues with our planet. And I'm originally Egyptian, and we have a saying in Arabic that says, stretch your legs as far as your blanket. So really it is the equivalent of live within your means. And in the case of our planet, we certainly aren't living within our means. So how can our leaders, and we're not even talking about leaders of tomorrow, but our leaders of today, take us from our current use of a planet and a half on a trajectory of getting to 2 planets back down to living within our means, within our blanket of 1 planet? This was a nice sketch that was done by one of our members called Susie Watson. So when I'm not doing We Lead at the University of Cambridge, I also run the Impact Women's Network. And we were discussing about food and the challenges we were having on social and environmental and economic. And she pulled this together. I thought this was a real visual of the realities we're in, which, as you can see, kind of has lots of thoughts and questions. And we're grounded in a lot of mud and a lot of green, and together we're actually creating value, prosperity, health for our planet, not just for the humans, but for the others that share the planet with us. And so it is within that space that I'll talk about We Lead, about leadership, changing our thinking and thoughts, but also to keep in mind for those of you who don't work in food, that the principles and the experience are not only in food. A lot of these principles we see either when I work through the Impact Women's Network, which is completely non-disciplinary focused, we're completely interdisciplinary, and when I work also with the researchers through a program called Rising Wise. So while today it's still very much in food, and We Lead Food is very much grounded in our food systems, I think the lessons can be taken further. So I think it's very clear from the pictures that we've just seen, just in those pictures, let alone everything we actually know, that doing no harm is no longer good enough. And therefore, keeping doing what we've always done and expecting different results is essentially the proverbial definition of madness. And how did we get here? Again, with my entrepreneurial business lens, we've started elevating this entrepreneur stereotype entity, and it started with our Industrial Revolution, but certainly in the last probably couple of decades, there's been this real push because of national and economic imperatives to have startups and grow businesses, reduce unemployment. And so over time, this entrepreneur has become this superhero. It's a conquering man, maverick, self-made, and and it kind of gets also into a little melodramatic. Their wives leave them, they lose the kids, they've lost 3 houses before they've made it big or after. And so it's all really very dramatic and not entirely attractive. But the realities of it is, all stereotypes are grounded in some reality, and therefore an economic exploitative model, which was grow. We want more and more startups to grow faster and more, is really where that was being pushed. And certainly that doesn't tally very well with the limits of our planet. And we see then in food where we have the issues of food that's transported from areas that need it, food that's left to waste, artificial foods, the colors, the additives, the scandals. Not exactly a very pretty picture, but that's the stereotype. And actually, in many ways, that still stands in how entrepreneurship and business is thought of, and worse, taught. And therefore, we are actually replicating this model. And the danger of this is to have this idea that it's, leaders are naturally men, or men are naturally attracted to leadership. Men are naturally good at this, because those are the images we see. We see the Richard Bransons and the Lord Sugars and so on the covers of magazines. Thankfully, again, with the pandemic and the new political sphere, the women have done so well that we're seeing more female images. If we were in a room together, we could actually interact. I would ask you, to think, close your eyes and think about an entrepreneur or a leader. And typically it's about 2 to 3% who will think about a woman. And so there's this naturalness and which is really rather artificial. And therefore, men are it, but worse, as we've elevated these entrepreneurial stereotypes, we've also started to associate a little bit of specialness to them. And so only extraordinary people can be true entrepreneurs. And then it's only men, and they're typically white, and they're typically middle-aged, and yeah, they probably come from a tech background as well. And anyone who doesn't fit the mold, so if you're a man and you're Black, you're not such a natural fit. If you're a woman, if you're a woman and Black, my goodness, you really don't fit. And so as we get further and further away from the mold, there's this deficiency discourse that sets in. So we're not quite right. And therefore we need fixing, we need to change. And anything that doesn't fit must also therefore be not as good. And so we are labeled as underperforming. And as a result, you find that people who don't fit the mold might start to reject the term. I'm not a leader, I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm just running a business. I just inspire people, I'm just a teacher. And so we need to start to look at the paradigms we're working in and how whether our policies and programs are actually supporting the change we want. And these are some of the unhelpful behaviors, practices, and language that we see as a result of these elevated stereotypes. And so there's a lot of text here because I thought you might want the quotes on some of these to read in your own time and now, and I promise you the rest of my slides are not quite so busy. But this is a recent article by the Harvard Business Review, and it shows how investors ask men and women different questions. And the promotion questions are really about forward thinking. How are you going to do things? It's got a very positive connotation, and it's about achievement. Whereas prevention is protection, defense, and it's got kind of very negative thing, almost you're at risk, you're in danger. And they've correlated that to the amount of money you get. The more preventative questions you get, the less money you're likely to secure at the end. And so the bit on the side with all that text is actually telling you how that correlates so that you can see the extent of it, that it literally correlates by the number of questions, the more questions you get in prevention. But what is truly worse in this scenario is how the language affects behavior and reinforces the paradigm. Because when you are asked prevention questions, you answer in the same vein, and therefore you come across as needing protection, as being a more risky proposition, being less able, less set up, more nascent, whereas when you're answering the questions that are directed at the men in terms of promotion, you appear to be more in control, have more leadership qualities, have your business plan sorted, your customer base and your market is far more potentially lucrative. So there's the paradigm, the language, and the behavior that mutually reinforce each other. Likewise, when investors then describe men and women, that's also that was released 3 years ago, and I'm sure many of you came across it already because it created quite a bang. I mean, just look at the first line. When describing a young male entrepreneur, he is described as young and promising. When describing a female entrepreneur, young but inexperienced. Now, who would you want to invest in? If it's exactly the same business with the same experience, with the same potential, as soon as you're looking at something that's promising, that's exciting, someone who's inexperienced, I personally wouldn't want to give them my hard-earned cash. And certainly in terms of venture capitalists who are investing on behalf of others, our pension funds and so on, you certainly don't want to be investing in inexperienced. And then you can kind of read. So the language that's described is really rather shocking. what was potentially even more shocking was, one, that they didn't know they were doing this. When this was fed back to these investors, this was a surprise. They really did not know they were using these different languages and having these different attitudes to male and female entrepreneurs. And yet another level of shockingness, if that's a word, is that women were as guilty of doing this as the men. This wasn't uniquely reserved to the male investors. And so we have this perpetuating issue, this growth in our system, in our paradigms, and how things are and who people are, how things are done, how they should be done, and who they should be done by, resulting in women entrepreneurial leaders, women's business leaders, women entrepreneurs, startup entrepreneurs, having these challenges to overcome. They don't necessarily see or have access to support. They don't necessarily have access to skill developments in terms of training. And that's back to the language. If I don't see myself as an entrepreneur, you post any resources or education or training for entrepreneurs, I don't apply. Access to capital, we've just seen what the investors say about women. Access to markets, again, you don't look like Richard Branson. Do I trust you to sell me something? I'm not sure. Access to mentors and networks, again, mentors tend to mentor the young and the promising, not the young and the inexperienced. Access to networks is around sponsorship. Who takes you along to these things? Again, if you're young and promising, of course, you'll be invited to exciting dinners. If you're young and inexperienced, they'll say, come back in 3 years. Competing demands are also our society. We still have disproportionate care, responsibility, institutions, so on. All this. The top text here is, if only men were a little more like, if only women were more like men, we would do so much better. And I think that is really the danger here. And so while We Lead is a training program, I'm going to pick up on that when I get there, because we're not about trying to create women that are more like men. That really isn't the space we're in. So with all these challenges, deficiencies, our paradigm, our language, actually, we find that women entrepreneurs and women business leaders are actually building organizations and businesses that are lasting and that are good for us, they're good for business, they're good for the environment. In one study, they were showing that 1% increase in women directors resulted in a 7% increase in environmental practice. That means if you're going from nothing to a gender balanced top management team, you could be 7 times more employing 7 times more sustainability practices. So that's one bit. We're also seeing that women entrepreneurs are lower risk, despite everything that we've just seen from what the investors say about them. But actually, they deliver better results using less resources, more revenues, and we know they do better in times of crisis. And again, recent research has shown us this. And so this is a 2020 piece of work that has really shown that during the pandemic, women are better leaders. But they've been collecting data pre and post pandemics, and on the whole, they've got evidence that women have been outperforming men and are perceived also by their teams as better leaders. You wouldn't guess that from our stereotypes and how investors and other businesses want to deal with women leaders. But actually, we're getting more and more data that shows we're on the right track. We as women entrepreneurs build businesses that last. So business startups that go under and businesses that close, so this idea of discontinuation, is actually 10% lower for women. So again, that's part of the risk. If you're investing, working with women, women-led businesses survive for longer. So really, I hope I've made the case that we absolutely must fix the system and not the women. What we don't want is a nice, new, shiny set of women that are essentially better men. And so in We Lead, we take this head on. And we have a set of principles that we put in practice to shake the system. I will go through each one of those one by one and give you some examples as well from what we've been seeing on the ground. But to have a quick run through them, we eliminate the token dynamic. So this whole notion of having one woman in a room or a minority of women in predominantly a male environment, which we see in the food sector. While at the startup level, plenty of women, when you get to the top levels, it can be as low as 9%, just 9. So we're dropping down to single figures. We have the 30% club in the UK, and that is seen as the kind of the minimum value. We need to hit at least 30% women, not 9% women leaders in the food sector. And we need to increase the visibility. We do that, and We Lead. We create bonds. We're there to share information, resources, open doors, reconnect with the joy of working with women. And I have quite a bit to say about that. And it is all really built on purpose. So I put purpose on purpose, pun not intended, at the bottom of this list, because this is really the foundation of the program. Can we envision a sustainable, inclusive, resilient world and our role in it, each one as an individual, but also together? So picking up on that one, our members, we call them members more than anything else, we have 2 cohorts of women leaders that have gone through the programs, taking us to almost 100 women that have gone through the program, but we've got as many that have contributed to the program coming in, sharing value. So now our network is over 200 women of We leaders spread across the world, spread across the food sector. We cover policy, education, research, business, charities, development. It's all there. And what we're starting to look at these value exchanges going, what is our purpose? What is our role from within our own position within the food sector as well as system? And where is everybody else? So we look at that, the leadership as you would, as we would all understand it as ourselves, but we also look at collective leadership. As a group, as a building critical mass, how can we change what is seen, what is valued, what is exchanged? And we start to introduce these notions of multiple forms of value. Can we create social, environmental, and economic value? The tool you have in front of you there, this is the value mapping and exchange tool that we've developed at the University of Cambridge, and it gives us a language to discuss sustainability. Most people are quite clear on the value they're capturing, the value they're creating, and if they've gone through any sort of business leadership or entrepreneurship program, there'll always be things around value proposition and what value are you creating. But what we find as when you're talking about sustainability and wanting to change the world, what we really want to be looking at is what value are we missing? You know, if we're creating a lot of economic value, as typically business leaders do, what are the missed opportunities for creating social and environmental value? Looking at your stakeholders, can you give that bit more? Remember at the start, I was saying that doing no harm is no longer good enough. We must actually do good. And well, what is good? And therefore starting to look at your stakeholders and trying to capture and create value that might be missed. But also equally important is, where might value be destroyed? If I'm creating value by a new crop, but actually destroying biodiversity by it being less kind of biodiverse supporting, then what am I doing here? And so we had one of our startups this year that was talking about creating closed systems around waste, which are absolutely the right thing to do in terms of the human context, but actually in terms of supporting urban biodiversity that do to a large extent survive on what they get from us. That was a question there. What could they do? Could they do something else? So that is very core to WeLead through the program and beyond. This is one of a woman founder that founded Natural Machine, who's now part of the rising food stars of EIT Food. And they just created a 3D printer. Essentially, it's a 3D printer for food. Of itself, it had very little sustainability value. In fact, probably in terms of using its resources and electricity, it was more deficient than contributing positively. But as they rethought their machine and working with one of our partners in Iceland, actually it came about looking, okay, can they use bits of the fish that were completely sufficiently nutritious? All the nutrients were there, but it wasn't the bits of fish that we would typically be willing to eat or even used to eating. And therefore starting to 3D print nutritionally balanced meals from food side streams. And then they took it a step further and thought, well, actually, given that they print essentially softer food and pretty food, I think pretty, it was a real key point here. Well, how about, could they then create pretty nutritionally balanced food for children who were sick? And if my memory serves correctly, they experimented with feeding children who had cancer and were in hospital. And then they went on to expand that to providing nutritionally balanced meals to the elderly who were in hospital, who again might eat very little. And what you wanted was to encourage them to eat by the aesthetics of the food, but also to be able, through the machine and the ingredients, to really control what they were eating and kind of taking it into that targeted nutrition space. So a machine that was essentially technologically interesting for 3D printing food has then evolved into creating social and environmental value in multiple spheres. I promised to pick up on tokenism. So tokenism is really back to where you have a minority and a majority, in our case, male and female, and tokenism results in artificial behavior. That's one of the big problems with tokenism. If you are a member of the minority, and it doesn't have to be male and female, it could be science versus non-science or whatever two majority minority systems you've got. Those who are in the minority tend to adopt one of two behaviors. Either they emphasize the similarities with the majority, and they distance themselves from their own minority group, or they over-identify and display behaviors of the stereotype of the minority group, both of which are not particularly comfortable situations for the person that's there. But it is not conscious. You might feel that you're not comfortable. It's going to start creating stresses and these weird behaviors, but it isn't actually a conscious decision. And therefore, one of the things I ask at the beginning of We Lead is, how many of you would say that the worst leader you've met is a woman? Your worst manager, your worst experience was with a woman. And invariably, it is almost every single person in the room. And it's due to these token dynamics, because as you have women who start to display this hyper masculinity, having been either pressured into it, because we covered the stereotype at the beginning, if this is what you were expected to be like, you not only needed to be like a man, but you needed to be better like a man. And therefore you start adopting this hyper masculinity. And whether you are a man or a woman with hyper masculinity, that is not a comfortable person to be around, but it isn't necessarily a choice either. And so trying to find out why we're getting to that space is important. And it allows us then to reconnect with the joy of working with women and finding our tribe. So we are a network, we are a tribe, but we are very careful, back to this choice of language, we are not a support group. That isn't what it's about. Again, if we are a support group, therefore we need support. You know, these poor little women that need help and support and a leg up to succeed. So it isn't about support, but actually finding people who are like-minded, who finding your partners in crime, people who are as brave as you are, who are interested in shaking the things up, who fundamentally want to create a more sustainable system with you. And therefore, they are the people you take along with you. And back to this notion of collective leadership, they are those, while I hate military terms, but they are the people who will fight at your side. And so this was one of the cases we had with Rising Wise. We had a woman who was based in Sweden and another one who was in Estonia, who met We Lead, and together they set up a business bringing data into food, really riding and capitalizing on the personalization, targeted nutrition aspect of it. But both of them are very much sustainability oriented at the heart, and therefore looking at their food chain and the different players within their chains is really quite important to that. And these are probably two women who would have never met had they not come on We Lead. Now, this takes us to a really important point about, well, we talk about accessing resources and markets and redressing asymmetry of information. That really needs sponsors and not mentors. But you'll hear quite often that women get mentored and men get sponsored. And we really need the sponsors. The difference being, back to the same issue of we are not a support network, mentors, there's that connotation again of you need help, you need guidance, you need direction. Yes, there's also almost a hierarchy. You need someone who's better than you to tell you how to do it. Whereas sponsors are people who think you're amazing. They're there, they're your biggest cheerleaders. They can be your peers, they can be your subordinates, they can be potentially your mentors or in a more senior position, but they open the doors. And more importantly, they mention your name when they are behind closed doors around tables where you are not invited. And therefore, it is these sponsors that as women, we need to be sponsors for each other. But as leaders, whether men or women, the importance of remembering to keep sponsoring and supporting and pulling up a variety and a diversity of the next generation. And so part of the program is also creating these weak bonds, which links to sponsorship. It's not an entirely different point, but it adds a dimension. So-called weak bonds are the people you know well enough to remember, to mention, to promote, to invite into activities, but they're not your everyday coworkers, they're not your friends, they're not your family members. Those are the so-called strong bonds. Strong bonds love you almost no matter what. They think like you, they work closely. There's a little bit of boundaries into how much diversity there is in your strong bonds. And therefore, it is the weak bonds that are absolutely critical for innovation and creativity. And if we're going to talk about destabilizing systems, shaking things up, then we really need those weak bonds, because it is those bonds that are outside our strong circle that allow us to do things differently. That these will be the people with whom we can find the shared interest to create a new world, deliver us to a more sustainable food system, whereas our strong bonds will say, we've always done it this way, why would you want to do it differently? Oh, you're off on one of your new crazy ideas again. But no, you want these partners in crime. So I say that on We Lead, I spend a lot of time inciting mischief, going, yep, no, throw away the hackles. You need to actually go and do things your way. What world do you see? What better world do you see? And how can you get there? And probably most importantly, who do you need with you? This is a case of Bianca, who is based again in the UK, and she has completely embraced the weak bonds, broadening the networks, opening doors, and being a sponsor. And she now works with the researchers within her network, and at the moment is developing funding applications to the value of £30 million. She's done that only over the last year. It's not that she's been at this years. It's since she's been on the program, she came up with this vision, with the ideas, and has been building the networks and the accessing the resources. She's doing it for them. And she's working with both men and women, but she is acutely aware of the need for diversity and inclusion. And she really is doing it for everyone, generating that common value and shared value for everyone. One of the things that we find that we hear over and over again in We Lead, and the same thing actually in the Impact Women's Network, is that, oh, you're doing this, I didn't know you existed. And therefore, women are not visible to women, let alone to other people. So being able to see others with shared and varied experience, to be able to see others that inspire us, and to be able to share that visibility with others, so that when I sit around the table, I say around the board table, and I'm the only woman, but we're expected to bring in 6 experts, actually being able to bring in and nominate 3 women experts and 3 male experts, to have that balance in whatever it is we're doing, then starts to push our leadership to do that as well, leading by example. I had quite an uncomfortable situation last year where I was asked to nominate reviewers, and the first few names that came to my mind were men. And I really had to stop, and I said, I can't put forward only white, male, middle-aged names. And that was what was coming to me, because those were the successful entrepreneurs and leaders that had done it, were becoming investors, we were seeing again as mentors, and therefore their picture was imprinted on my mind. And I had to sit down and go through my LinkedIn account and go, right, I know that I know equally good women. So I'm not discounting the ability of the men, but I'm saying actually that women are equally good. We have made the case here that in some cases they're better. So we need to find them. They need to be visible, and they need to be on our mind. And that was one of the case with these two. They're both from the University of Cambridge. And until they came to We Lead, they'd never met. They'd never even heard of each other. And yet they were in the same institution and interested in very similar things. They have since then gone on. They've secured a grant, and they're starting to shake things up in Africa. They started 6 months ago. So really what we're saying with fixing the system is this picture, which again you might have seen. We're aiming towards justice, where it isn't about scaffolding those who are different, but creating a system where everyone can play to their strengths, everyone is protected, and everyone can actually perform to their best ability. And I had somebody challenge me on the last picture saying, well, surely our objective is to have no fence there. And that may be true in some contexts, but actually, if you look in this context, it's a football game. That fence is protection for everyone, but allowing everybody to see, cheer, and be involved is where it becomes a more inclusive field. So to achieve that, we really need several things. And you may have guessed so far where I was going with this. I started by saying I have no answers, but also from the title of my talk, you might have been misled into thinking that I was going to define a type of leadership. But it isn't a type of leadership, but it is multiple forms of leadership. We need that diversity in the way we do things as much as anything. I might have given our hyper masculine or even masculine and male colleagues a bit of a bashing, but actually they also have their strength and their place. And it's sitting alongside having those diversities, given that none of us have the answers and contexts differ. We actually need that diversity of leadership, of thought, of doing things. But we need to move towards these points, even though it's not quite a checklist. Oh, I've done it or I haven't done it. But we need to move towards embracing value creation, and that's more that multiple forms of value. And we need to take an interest in real global problems, the intersections of big trends, food and population growth, food and urban sprawl, food and biodiversity loss. Is as we start to look at these intersections is when the challenges are bigger, but the potential for impact is higher. And to do that, we need new mindsets, new skills. We absolutely need to move beyond pandering to consumerism and avoid favoring and elevating the one and true stereotype, whether it is in the types of innovation or business model or the person and leader. So with that, you may have thought that you just got away with someone not mentioning the US elections. I will end by putting kind of this message and image to you. And actually, the beautiful poem that was read, part of it was, there's always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. And here, I invite us all to be the leaders that are that light, and we can shine in all our multi-colored gloriousness, mosaic of our individuality and diversity. And with that, I thank you very much. And these are my details in case anybody would like to get in touch further. Thank you. And thank you, Corinna, you've just appeared. Shall I stop sharing?
Yeah, I think you can stop sharing now. Thank you so much, Shima. That was really fantastic and inspirational, and lots of things, lots of sentences I was taking note of there. But the one that I wrote in capitals with asterisks by was that the network to be part of is the people who are as brave as you are. And I think that framing is so completely different to you need to find people who are going to support you with all your struggles. So it's just such a completely different, and the idea of what we think of, and it's interesting that the quote from the poet laureate was also, it had that word brave. What does that word brave actually mean, and what does it involve? Fantastic, Shima, thank you so much indeed. I've had some nice comments in the chat congratulating you for your presentation. And I also have some questions here, and please do, if you're in the audience, today, please do continue to put your questions into the Q&A if you could. I have a first question, Shima, from Stephanie, and it relates back to the earlier part of your talk when you were talking about the tensions in moving forward food system sustainability. And she asked, what are the situations where a women entrepreneur prioritizes environmental or social sustainability, and that means that profits are not as high as they might be? Is that metric going to then say, well, she's a woman entrepreneur and she's not so successful?
Yes, the short answer is absolutely. And that's part of fixing the system, because the current paradigm would be, oh, for goodness sake, will you leave some of those environmental obsessions to the side? You need to focus on the business. Your numbers aren't good. You can push up, da, 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 da. And therefore, what we're saying is actually those should not be the metrics that we are defined by. And back to our limits of the planet, if we have more organizations with entrepreneurs that are creating social and environmental value and enough economic value to keep the organization growing, because we need enough of that to continue creating the impact. If there isn't enough money flowing into the business to have the social and environmental business, then you'll impact, then you'll go out of business. But it's absolutely true that that cannot be the way they're measured, and currently it is. And there's some research that shows that women's businesses are typically more grounded in communities and geared towards creating these impacts, and therefore have lower economic returns in the SME sphere. And therefore, instead of being seen as a model for more sustainable business and enterprise, they're actually bashed for not making enough money. That's a different talk that I give every once in a while. I set out all the elements of women's entrepreneurship, and then I go, does this sound good? They go, oh yeah, it's great. And going, well, actually, all these things are what women's entrepreneurs are criticized for.
Oh dear. Very illuminating answer, though. Again, you talked at the beginning about the use of language, and who get asked, has the language changed in the last 10 years in your experience about women entrepreneurs and women in these kinds of roles?
Well, sadly not. The language I presented is 3 years old. It's that recent. And that's why it rocked things. Everybody was starting to say, oh, it's, we're seeing the numbers, number of women rise and so on. But actually, it's depressing how little has changed over the last years. I was looking at the numbers in the last decade. The percentage of women entrepreneurs hasn't changed. I'm particularly interested in kind of innovations and tech, and the numbers are around 7 to 9% of women entrepreneurs are in that. Well, no, 7 to 9% of entrepreneurs in the tech space are women, and the numbers seem stable, and about a third of all entrepreneurs are women. And again, the numbers aren't shifting. But we've seen with the language from investors 3 years ago, it's no wonder the numbers aren't shifting. The perceptions and the language is, we've still got a long way to go.
Indeed, a long way to go. I'm quite surprised, actually. It's disappointing, but good.
But there's more of us who are aware of it, I think. So the more we can challenge that and have the discussions that we have today, and it's delightful how many people are here today. But these are the sorts of things where there's no magic wand, we're not going to change it. But as long as we're all chipping away at it, then we're eroding this paradigm and creating the spaces to create new ones.
Yeah. And a question from Rebecca here. You mentioned token dynamics. And I'm going to read the question exactly to make sure I don't misinterpret it. She says, is there a way token dynamics can be rephrased to address the actual gap of less women in leadership positions? Something along the lines of a significant accountability measure. With the elimination of token dynamics, what are the other ways we can maintain a flowing pipeline of women into leadership roles? And she later makes the point that in most lower middle income countries, token dynamics have been used in educational institutions to increase the number of women joining programs, accessing resources. So yeah, what are the alternatives to using token dynamics to increase the flow of women in that pipeline?
I think I might need to separate two issues out. I think Rebecca's talking about quotas, which I hadn't touched on. The token dynamics result by just the fact that you have a minority of a group of some sort of characteristic within a majority. And as soon as you have that minority, it's a social dynamic that kicks in. The quotas are where they could create these token dynamics or not, because then the quotas is where you say, we need 10% women, we need 30% women, and therefore you're creating the size of that minority group. So I think that's in different, and I think, so I don't know if Rebecca wants to elaborate on the question, but that's what the 30% Club is doing, is they've set not a quota, but a target, because again, some research finds that when you cross the third of a minority group, it starts to change things and they don't feel so minor than if you've only got 5-10% or one woman at a board table. So they've set that as a target, and companies are buying into that, and they're trying to push to ensure that their senior leadership and their boards are at 30%. So the 30% Club targets boards in particular, or has, and is now starting to encourage them to follow the same principles for their leadership. But it's when you've got a sizable enough group that, in this case, we're talking about women, that as a woman, you no longer feel as a token, you're not in such a small minority, that token dynamics go away. And therefore you don't start displaying these artificial behaviors. And what I thought Rebecca was asking was, because we have these artificial behaviors, it explains the pipeline, because if as a token, I'm over-identifying with the deficiency discourse, I'm a poor woman, I need training, I need help, therefore I don't apply, I don't step up, I don't ask for resources, then yes, that makes the pipeline more problematic, because you have the women falling back instead of progressing as they would with the herd, so to speak.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Usman asks, it seems that the investor networks can be highly problematic in terms of their willingness to support sustainable venture led by women. To what extent are more equitable investor networks coming into being? How can we create investment networks with more progressive dynamics?
So that's where the picture is a lot rosier. They are growing. We work quite closely with an investment organization called Matador that's founded by Severine Black, who is very vocal in her support for diversity, inclusion, impact, sustainability. And there are more and more of those going on, and particularly in food. So that's again where the context, we're quite privileged here. We might not see that if we're looking at, I don't know, low energy microchips, but in food, we're seeing more and more of these impact investment networks, angels, VCs. So that's coming along, and I think that's a real lever in our system.
Great, that's good to hear. Louise has a practical question. Do you know of any programs currently available to support setting up a social enterprise that is not commercially focused? So looking at social and environmental value creation.
I know the one we have at the University of Cambridge, we've got one. We've got a social ventures program, so that's worth looking into.
Great, excellent, thank you. Now, you mentioned about sponsors rather than mentors, and Stephanie has a question about that. How do you find the sponsors? How do you and educate them about being a sponsor? And how do you create those sponsors and get women in front of them?
Very good question. So not an easy answer, but again, unpicking some of it. In many ways, it's like finding a mentor. You need to find someone you click with, that appreciates what you do. If you can, has a vested interest in what you do, they're more likely to remember you if you're kind of closely aligned with where they are. But actually, the crux of it is probably just asking. And that sometimes is the hard one. Is it's not an easy conversation to have, is to sit down and say, this is what I'd like to do. You sit on XY committees. What are you hearing? If you hear something, could you make sure I am mentioned if 1, 2, or 3 types of opportunities come up? And you need to have those conversations. I mean, we all know ourselves, when someone says something to us, we don't necessarily remember it in 6 months' time. So it's keeping those connections going, reminding people of what you do, the value that you create, and it's back to also the weak bonds. So build the network, ask, and make sure that you have many weak bonds so that you're increasing the chance of somebody that remembers that you're doing something interesting and that you want to do something even more interesting when they hear about it.
That's great. And I wanted to ask, Shima, you've made a really strong case that this is about allowing women to be women with characteristics and moving forward, and not trying to be men, and not trying to train them as if they're deficient. At the same time, in my own, I can talk from my own experience, it can be so challenging to navigate the space and navigate. I mean, we're talking about sponsors here. One issue that I've been talking about with colleagues is the idea of networking up, where you are actually approaching people who you admire, whatever. This is a more junior phase in one's career, but and finding people that that can then take that role. But it can be extremely daunting. And all of these things come into play about, well, who am I to go and talk to that person, and they're just going to think I'm just some little person, and all of these things, which are essentially confidence issues. And rightly or wrongly, a lot of women, a lot of people do suffer from confidence issues, and that's why I think some of the training programs then focus on building confidence among women. And that is a kind of training. It is a kind of saying, well, you are deficient because you're not confident enough. I don't know whether I've articulated that clearly, but I'm just trying to work that out intellectually in my mind about how that works.
So I think you've given me a lot to work with there. So I'm smiling because I'm going to try not to ramble, because there's lots of bits there that I get quite excited about. So the networking up takes energy, time. What we really should be doing is training the up to not need the networking. So we've got to tackle in how do we train, and I'm waiting to see what the results of this, but the University of Cambridge has launched in the last year an inclusive leadership training for the university leaders. And so we need to kind of see how that's going to play out. But the idea there is really the leaders that so this is the equivalent of, I think, Lean In. The book has some very interesting content, but the notion of lean in bothers me, because we shouldn't be leaning in. Where are we seeing the book of them leaning out? And it's the same thing with it. So sometimes it's that training, and it's the same thing with the confidence. Research over kind of again and again shows that women have a more realistic view of their abilities, whereas men have overconfidence. And the problem is that this confidence does actually open doors, create images. So this overconfidence gives a certain privilege. But again, instead of training women to be overconfident, we really need to train the world around them to be able to read the signals. And we see it in pitches. You have the young pups, and apologies to anybody who's here from the US, but it's a very American thing. And I don't know what you all do at schools because they're phenomenal speakers, they're performers, they're this, but actually that's not really about the business. We don't want this slick performance. What we want is a solid business, and women will provide you a more balanced view of the reality than you get the other side. But instead, we get pulled in, and we all do. We see this performance and you go, wow. But you don't want the wow, you want the solid. And so the confidence bit, again, it's a flipping. We need to train recruitment committees to be able to read CVs written by women, to read between the lines and pick up the nuances in an interview when you're interviewing a woman. And finally, again, I thought where you were going is that a lot of women suffer from imposter syndrome. And that is true, but there is the equal number of men that suffer from imposter syndrome as well. But for some reason, that's become a women's issue. Oh yeah, we need to have confidence trainings because all these women suffer from imposter syndrome. But it's not the quite true. I'm waiting to see the program that encourages men to go for training to overcome their imposter syndrome.
But these are really fantastic points, and I remember, if you don't mind me sharing, giving a talk once to some industry CEOs, and they were making the point about needing to educate children about healthy food and educate people about healthy food and so on, which is very common. And my riposte was, well, the most important thing we need to do is to educate the elite. But I'm not sure it was very well understood. But I think it's not something. It's always the people at the bottom somehow that need educating rather than the people at the top.
And that they always have to ask. That's the other thing, because you hear about you need education, you need to negotiate, and you kind of think, why? Surely if the system was fair and inclusive, you wouldn't have to do that. You'd have access to healthy, nutritious food. You wouldn't have to negotiate your salary because roles would be properly evaluated. And no matter who you were paid for the work that you were done. And if you looked like you were being underpaid, your manager would come and say, I think you're underpaid. We're going to give you a raise. You shouldn't have to ask. And when you're ready to be promoted, you should also be promoted on your ability, not on your ability to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. Very true. Brilliant stuff. So Lindy says, in research in 2016, and by the way, do keep the questions coming in. Be great to see some more questions coming on here. I've got quite a few now, but do keep them coming in. So in 2016, in research, she was looking at food company boards. And it struck her that there were more women directors were in posts like human resources, which are, I don't know how to say it, but more
feminized.
Yeah. And again, she's asking, it seemed to be perhaps tokenistic that the people on the boards were from more of those roles. Again, how can we change this?
So that's really well spotted. And it's also a compound problem because these roles have been feminized and therefore also considered of lower importance. You would think that if HR performed as well as it could, and instead of becoming human resources, became human resources development or human resources management, which sometimes it is, and some departments do have that. That is core to the business. In entrepreneurship, we always talk about the importance of the team, and the success of the business is built on people, people, people. And yet the HR function in most businesses is marginalized. And so which came first? I don't know. It's a chicken and egg situation. More women got into this, so it became less important, or it was seen as a safer space. But you're right, when it comes to the CEO, the strategy, sometimes even the COO and so on, that's still very much a male club. I'm seeing a change in the younger generation, but I don't necessarily mean by age. I mean in the upcoming ones and upcoming startups. The newer startups seem to have that shaken up a little bit, but it's back to other conversations is creating these systems. I mean, if the investors value the women, your team members value what you're doing, then suddenly you're far more welcome in the space. I think at the moment we're in limbo where we know a lot of things, but most of us have grown up in a social space that keeps telling us of how we should be, where we should be, what we should be doing, and where we're not. And we feel unwelcome in roles like the CEO or the CTO and so on. So that has to kind of go both ways. And if I was to kind of, I think the question was, how do we kind of fix that? That's got to come down to education. Most business leaders and entrepreneurs will go through training. This whole professional development space that's got to come through the training there. That's for both sides. And when it's in the startup space, it's the mentors. We need mentors that are more clued in, and that's both on sustainability as well as inclusion and diversity, because the mentors have so much steering power on a startup team. They look at them like gods. You know, what am I going to do about this? I'm stuck in this. They help them out. They open doors. So the mentors are a real guiding light. And that's another bottleneck, just like the investors. And whereas we're seeing the investors unlocking, you know, there's more and more in that impact investment state, I'm a little disappointed with the mentor sphere. And therefore we launched a mentor academy this year, because you know, you can teach, you can support, we can have discussions, but if at the crunch point, these startups come to choose a team or hire or take a direction, and the mentor goes, nah, leave that sustainability to the side until you can make business, then we can pick it up, then that's detrimental. If the mentor, they usually help them recruit. If all they're doing is bringing in other young scientific men into it, or as usually happens, oh, you need an experienced business CEO, and up they get another young man as well, then that really isn't helpful. So the mentors is another space we really need to look at.
So much to do. Sarah makes the point, it's a comment really, that about hierarchy still being so strong in so many institutions, and that not helping the kind of merging from the people who are higher up in the hierarchy and the people who want to make their way. Any response to that?
I'm not entirely sure what the question is, so I'll give some reflections about kind of sitting at the same table. Reverse mentoring schemes work quite well to be able to give those connections, and they work both ways. It actually genuinely gives insights to the leaders that are at the top end of the hierarchy on what's happening on the lower end of the hierarchy and how to better manage their business. But then it also opens up communication channels. I think probably communications are more stepwise rather than shunted, so to speak, in hierarchies. So I speak a lot about wriggle room, and I think even at the lower end, creating some wriggle room. And if you can speak to 2 levels above you and they then sponsor you 1 level up, then you can kind of maneuver that. I think we continue to be hierarchical. Startups are not, but then as they grow, they need to be. There is a genuine need for organization and hierarchy that comes with it as you grow and you're dealing with lots of people and building an organization. I also think as humans, and this is just a personal thing, I have no research or any info on this, but just insights into being interested in animals and so on. There's lots of animal groupings that have hierarchies. I'm wondering whether as humans we have a tendency to hierarchy and we need it. And I know we discuss it in the space with women, is if you don't step into a power sphere, someone always will. So even when you're trying to create flatter systems, there will also be informal hierarchies. There's always power plays. And so yeah, that's a murky environment. I'm not sure that one we're going to get out of anytime soon, but the more channels of communication and information we can create, the better it is for everybody.
Sure. And I think what will be the final question from Katie? She says, if gender itself is becoming more fluid, particularly among the younger generation, could we see a natural decline in token dynamics over the next 20 years or so?
I haven't spent much time thinking about that, but my knee-jerk reaction is I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. When you're in the gender neutral, fluid, undecided sphere, almost everything else other than male or female at the moment, that's a difficult space to be in. But the change is coming and people are aware and institutions are, but that's also where the abuses are. So I think that one, as more and more people come for a while, it's going to get more difficult. And then when there's enough people, again, at that magic 30%, we'll see a flip. So that's just a guess.
Well, thank you for asking that rich sets of questions from the audience tonight.
Yeah, brilliant questions. Thank you.
And thank you very much to the audience for asking such fantastic questions and for listening and engaging with Shima's talk, which I think everybody from the comments that we've received found incredibly stimulating. And it just makes me think, and I'm sure many others have responded in the same way, just how important it is to focus on this and to invest time on this issue. If we're going to be scrabbling around in the weeds trying to make change, this is big stuff. This is where the big change is going to happen, and that underpins, I think, the changes that we want to see. So very inspiring, and really you've obviously thought so much about this. Your thinking is really incredible, Shima, on this issue, and obviously your experience of running the We Lead Free program as well. So best of luck to the program. Good luck to the people on it. I do apply. It sounds like it's a wonderful program. So thank you very much for your inspiring talk tonight, and thanks to the audience, and until next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corinna, and thank you, audience, for brilliant questions and giving me the chance to talk about my favorite subject.
Right. Thank you so much, Shima. Thank you, everybody. Bye.